Hey guys, we're going to start chapter 9 on cellular respiration with this video, so please follow along here.
Synthesis. Okay, next let's go to cellular respiration. What happens in cellular respiration? Cellular respiration, we're actually using the energy in those sugars, so in glucose. In the presence of oxygen, we're breaking that down into carbon dioxide and water, and we're releasing energy from that. So let's see what that looks like. So we break down that glucose. That's a exergonic reaction. We're releasing energy. We're making carbon dioxide, we're making water, but we're mostly making energy in the form of ATP that we can use. Again, it's not as simple as this, so let's get to what respiration really looks like and where it takes place. And in order to do cellular respiration, you need a mitochondria, and you also need one more thing. You need O2, you need oxygen. So the parts of the mitochondria that you should become familiar with, first of all, we've got an outer membrane. Outer membrane is going to be this portion right here. We also have an inner membrane, so it looks like that. We have an inner membrane space. The inner membrane space is going to be right between the outer and the inner membrane. And you see here that we have these folds that go on the inside of that inner membrane. And what that does is increase the surface area. But the last thing that we should become familiar with is actually called the matrix. Matrix is going to be the inside of the mitochondria. And so the parts of cellular respiration, the first part is called glycolysis. That'll actually take place out here. Next thing is going to be the Krebs cycle. Krebs cycle will take place in here. That's in the matrix. And then finally, we have the electron transport chain. Electron transport chain is going to take place along that inner membrane. And so the reason we have that folds is to increase surface area. Now, this looks a little scary, the diagram, but it shouldn't be that scary because we're going to miss all the intermediates. So what do we start with? Glucose, and we break that down into pyruvate. One thing that you should know is that glucose is a 6-carbon molecule. And down here at pyruvate, we have 2 3-carbon molecules. We release a little bit of ATP in glycolysis, and that takes place outside of the mitochondria. Next, we enter into the Krebs cycle. In the Krebs cycle, we're going to take that carbon, which is in pyruvate, and we're going to release that as carbon dioxide. But the important thing we're doing in the Krebs cycle is we're storing energy. We're storing energy as NADH, NAD, and FADH2, or FAD. So we're storing the energy that was found in the pyruvate in NAD and FAD, so we can finally use that in the electron transport chain. Let's look at what happens in a little more detail as far as the electron transport chain. We've stored energy now in NAD, and we've stored energy in FAD. We're going to transfer that energy in the form of electrons. Just like in photosynthesis, we've now got an electron transport chain. It's not in the thylakoid, it's the inner membrane. But as we transfer that electron through the electron transport chain, we're pumping protons to the outside of the inner membrane. So it's now in this inner membrane space. We now have a buildup of all this positive charge here. The only place it can go is through our friend ATP synthase, and we eventually make ATP. So that energy that you use right now, that energy that you're using to think, to move, all of the actions, that ATP comes from that flow of those protons through here. Now, the puzzle's not quite complete because we've dropped off that energy of NADH and FADH2. Let's follow what happens to that electron. That electron is eventually going to combine with oxygen and hydrogen, and we're going to make H2O. And so who's pulling that electron the whole way? Our friend oxygen. Oxygen is pulling that electron towards it. It's highly electronegative. And when it finally gets to it, we've made our product. We've made our H2O, which is given off, but more importantly, we've made ATP, and we've made energy through this process of cellular respiration. So photosynthesis and respiration are how we utilize energy, free energy from the sun, to make ATP, to make ourselves grow. So I hope that's helpful.
Thanks, Mr. Anderson. You're always helpful. All right, here we go. Chapter 9. I'm going to do this in a couple different parts. So this first video is just going to be an overview. Then I'm going to do glycolysis and the Krebs cycle together in a video. And the next one will be on ETC, and the last one will be on fermentation. So 4 videos. They'll all be a little bit shorter, so hopefully that maybe helps you out. All right, so cellular respiration. So living cells require energy obviously, from outside sources in order to perform many tasks. We learned about that in the last chapter when we talked about free energy, and that's the energy that we use in our cells to perform whatever tasks that they need to. But really, it's just finding a way to use our food. So, for instance, this giant panda is going to obtain energy from eating plants. It's going to use that energy through cellular respiration, or harness that energy through cellular respiration. So energy flows into a system as sunlight. So you can see that if I grab my pen here a second. Right here, it's our sunlight. And that's going to go in and through photosynthesis, which we'll learn in chapter 10, is going to make organic molecules such as glucose, and is also going to make oxygen, which happen to be the two things that we need for cellular respiration. So organic molecules and oxygen are going to go into the mitochondria. You're going to create CO2 and water. So you maybe have wondered in your life, why do I breathe in oxygen? Why do I breathe out carbon dioxide? Well, it's right here. You breathe in oxygen so that your body can perform cellular respiration. You breathe out CO2 so that your body can, because your body is releasing it in cellular respiration. Okay, and it just so happens that our world is perfectly set up so that photosynthesis uses those things, and cellular respiration then uses what photosynthesis makes. So it's a cycle in that way. So pretty cool stuff. All right. Let me get back here. So first section, again, I'm just going to overview cellular respiration. So catabolic pathways yield energy by oxidizing organic fuel. So let's just, again, review a couple terms on here. Catabolic, I remember in the last chapter I talked about, I don't really like cats. So I learned catabolic by cats break things. So what does catabolic pathway do? We are breaking things down. So the breakdown of organic molecules is exergonic. So again, this is catabolic. We are going to break things down. In this case, we'll talk about glucose. And that is exergonic, meaning it's going to release energy so that our bodies can use them. Another catabolic process that I'll get into later is fermentation. And this is a partial degradation of sugar that occurs when there's no oxygen present. Sometimes this can be called anaerobic respiration, versus cellular respiration would be aerobic respiration. And that just refers to aerobic means with oxygen. Anaerobic would be without oxygen. So this is an anaerobic process. So cellular respiration is the most prevalent and efficient catabolic pathway in the entire world. It's pretty crazy to think about, but most living things use this, and it's really effective at getting us usable energy. It happens in the mitochondria. So as we learned in chapter 6, the mitochondria is like the powerhouse of the cell. This is where we make our energy usable to us, and that's what cellular respiration does. It happens in the mitochondria. So we're going to use oxygen and organic molecules such as glucose. So what do we use? Oxygen and glucose. And the main goal is to create ATP. There are some byproducts, some waste products like carbon dioxide and water. But the main goal is to create ATP, energy. Now, it is important to point out, it does say organic molecules. We're going to talk about glucose specifically, but just keep in mind you eat more than just glucose. You can use fats and proteins also, but glucose is just the most useful. Our body is most efficient at using glucose, so that's why we focus on that. Similar to the combustion of a gas engine, like your car that you drive, after oxygen is mixed with fuel, so oxygen is the fuel, food is the fuel in cellular respiration, and the exhaust is water and carbon dioxide. So it's kind of a similar process. In order to keep working, cells must regenerate ATP. Remember we talked in chapter 8 how if a cell can't do work, it is dead. So we need that constant influx of energy so that we avoid disorder, that second law of thermodynamics. So in order to keep working, cells must be able to regenerate ATP. In order to make ATP, the main way that we do that is through cellular respiration. So we're going to get into a term called redox reactions, which you probably learned about in chemistry. So these are oxidation and reduction. And catabolic pathways will yield energy due to the transfer of electrons. That energy would have come from your food and is released later in order to make ATP through cellular respiration. So let's just go through a couple of those in a little bit. What is a redox reaction? Again, these transfer electrons from one reactant to another by either oxidation or reduction. So oxidation is when a substance loses electrons, and then we say that substance is oxidized. Versus in reduction, a substance gains electrons or is reduced. So let me give you a little mnemonic to remember this. Some of you probably have heard this before. If we have oil rig. Okay, so what that stands for is oxidation is loss. So oxidation is loss. Reduction is gain. So if you can remember oil rig, oxidation is loss, reduction is gain. You can always remember where those electrons are going. So hopefully that helps you. So just some example of redox reactions. If we looked at this one, we have sodium and chloride. So in this case, we can see that sodium has become oxidized. It is positively charged. So it has lost an electron. It makes sense. If it's positively charged, it would have lost an electron. And chlorine in this case would become reduced and it has gained electron, which makes sense why it would have that negative charge. So some redox reactions do not completely exchange electrons, and they can change the degree of electron sharing in the covalent bond. So that kind of shows this. Here we have methane and oxygen, and then this carbon would be oxidized, and this oxygen would be reduced in water. Just showing you that. Again, redox, just remember oil rig. Reduction is gain, or oxidation is loss, and that's just talking about the electrons. So in this case, cellular respiration, this is what we should focus on here as far as reduction, oxidation, and reduction. This is the cellular respiration equation. So we start, if I grab my pen here quick, this is glucose. Okay, glucose is going to become oxidized, so it's going to lose electrons, and that's going to go and be eventually made into carbon dioxide. Oxygen is going to become reduced. Reduction is gain, so they're going to gain electrons, and that's going to become water. And in that process, we make energy, which is in the form of ATP. Okay, so that's the overall process of cellular respiration. So cellular respiration oxidizes glucose in a series of steps. We have to do this in a series of steps. If it wasn't in a series of steps, it would be too big of an energy release and we wouldn't be able to harness it. So electrons from organic compounds, like again, think glucose for that organic compound for most of this, they're usually going to be first transferred to NAD, which is a coenzyme. And what does NAD become? Well, if we look over here, through this reaction, NAD becomes NADH. And NADH is what we would call an electron carrier. So what happened is NAD got reduced. Remember, reduction is gain, so NADH gained an electron. So what is NADH? Is an electron carrier because it got reduced. Okay? And this would all happen in the catabolism of glucose, the breakdown of glucose. One of the things that we'll make is NADH was an electron carrier. So NADH is the reduced form. Again, it gained an electron. So that NADH is symbolizing that it gained an electron. So you can see here was a plus. So when we gain an electron, there's no charge on there anymore. And its job is to pass that electron, carry its electron to the ETC. That's its job. And that electron is going to help us make ATP eventually as it falls, in quotations, it falls down its energy, eventually going to oxygen. So if electron transfer was not stepwise, I just mentioned this, but if we went all the way from high energy here to low energy here, we would have an explosive release of heat and light energy. This would be an uncontrolled reaction, and it would be really, really hard for your body to harness that energy. So what we have to do is we have to break that release of energy into a series of steps instead of that explosive reaction. And what that allows us to do is harness that energy in the form of ATP. So you can see we harness that, we do it in a series of steps, and what do? We create ATP. So I just want to break this diagram down a little bit. What we have up here, this would be high energy, right? Because Gibbs free energy is going up by that arrow, you can see. This would be low energy then down here, right? And one of the things that we have here, this is where the energy went. So energy went from our food eventually into ATP. Now it's going to be via NADH, so it's going to use NADH in order to help with that process. And where does it eventually end up? The electrons end up in oxygen, which then becomes water. So let me just show you this overall progression as far as where is the energy. It started in our food. That's where the energy started. It's going to transfer that energy to mostly NADH, which is, again, an electron carrier. The electron carrier is going to bring that energy to the ETC, the electron transport chain. And then eventually that electron transport chain is going to transfer that electron to oxygen. And the energy ends up as ATP. So the electron ends up in oxygen, the energy ends up in ATP. So that's the overall process again. All right, there's 3 steps to this cellular respiration. Maybe remember these from your freshman year. Glycolysis, the citric acid cycle, or also known as, this is the Krebs cycle. So you'll maybe hear me talk about the Krebs cycle. The citric acid cycle and the Krebs cycle are interchangeable terms, and you should be aware of that. And then there's this new term, oxidative phosphorylation, which is a term you didn't talk about as freshmen. But you did talk about the ETC as freshmen. So oxidative phosphorylation is the ETC plus what we call in AP biology chemiosmosis. Okay. So that'll be what we'll talk about in one of my videos. We'll talk about how oxidative phosphorylation involves the ETC and chemiosmosis. So glycolysis. Glycolysis happens in the cytoplasm. It is only the only part of cellular respiration that does not occur in the mitochondria, and its job is to break down glucose into 2 molecules of pyruvate. Okay, it's also going to make 2 molecules of NADH. It's going to make 2 molecules of ATP as well. But its main job is to start the process of breaking down glucose. If you look at this term, glycolysis, glyco means sugar, lysis means to break. So what are we doing? We're breaking down sugars. Okay, and then what happens is through the citric acid cycle or the Krebs cycle, now those 2 pyruvate that were made here are going to go into the mitochondria, and they're going to complete the breakdown of glucose. This is where you're going to make your CO2. You're also going to make a lot of NADH and a little bit of FADH2, which are both electron carriers. And they're both going to carry that energy in the electron to the electron transport chain. So you can see oxidative phosphorylation is driven by the electron transport chain. It makes by far the most ATP of this whole process. And it's also going to involve chemiosmosis. Electrons from NADH and FADH2 are going to be transferred into that ETC, and they're going to end up with oxygen in this process, which is going to then make water. And the energy released can then synthesize ATP. And this is going to happen on the inner membrane of the mitochondria. It's going to involve, again, electron transport and chemiosmosis. Those two together are going to be oxidative phosphorylation, which makes about 90% of the ATP that is made in the cellular respiration is made in oxidative phosphorylation. So I'm sure that sounds like a lot. Again, just a reminder, we will review each of those steps. So this is just kind of the overall process. We see that the formatting isn't great, but here we start with glucose. Glucose gets broken down into pyruvate. We do make a little bit of ATP via substrate level phosphorylation. You also make some NADH, and you can see that's eventually going to go here to the ETC. So that pyruvate goes into the citric acid cycle, the Krebs cycle. You can see now we're in the mitochondria. You're going to make a little bit of ATP here. You also make some carbon dioxide. You're going to mostly make, though, NADH and FADH2. Again, you can see both of those go into oxidative phosphorylation. We're going to do ETC and chemiosmosis, and you're going to make a lot of ATP via oxidative phosphorylation in that process. So if we look at oxidative phosphorylation, oxidative, you should think oxygen. Phosphorylation, think making of ATP. We're going to phosphorylate ATP to make it. So glycolysis in the Krebs cycle, they work via substrate level phosphorylation, so it requires enzymes in order to do that. We're not going to go really into the nuts and bolts of how this works because you just need to know kind of the overall process. But you can see we have a substrate that would be your phosphate being added to your ADP, adenosine diphosphate, and when we eventually what happens is we create ATP in that process. So that's substrate level phosphorylation. I'm going to stop this video here. I'll go through glycolysis on the next one.